I want to begin, as always, by thanking the three organizations that make this possible. The Judson Memorial Church, in which you are currently seated, which makes this space available to us every month. The Left Forum, that organization that brings you that very large conference, usually in May or June of each year. The last couple of years at the John Jay School of CUNY up on the Upper West, or the West Side, Midtown Manhattan. And Democracy at Work, the organization with which I work. And those three together bring you this monthly event. I want to remind you also that in addition to all of you that come here and that pay your $10, for which we are much obliged, but you are actually the smaller part of our audience, because we produce, thanks to Brian standing in the back working the camera, we produce a video version of tonight's talk, and that goes up sometime in the next 24 hours, and that is seen literally around the world. We get emails from every continent, from almost every country, for people who now watch on a monthly basis, and so I want to direct two comments to them. You get it for free, whereas the good people here pay $10. So we want to appeal to you, I'm looking right at you in the camera, to send us the $10 that would make it possible for us to function. Even though you're not in the room, you get the video version. And also, of course, anyone who is deeply moved to remove money from his or her wallet in order to help us beyond the $10, we will gratefully acknowledge any such contribution. We are what is called a 501c3 organization, which means we are tax exempt both at the federal level and in the state of New York. So all contributions to us are fully tax exempt, for those of you that, for whom that matters. I want to briefly remind you also that we do this the second Wednesday of every month, which means we will be here again on the 14th of October, which is the second Wednesday of that month. And so if you want to make any kind of plans, note please, we will be here then. And the last announcement before we jump into tonight's substance has to do with a question a number of you asked me last time about our radio program. It's called Economic Update. It's a 1-hour program. It's on the radio every week. Here in the New York area, it's on WBAI, 9 o'clock Friday morning, immediately after Amy Goodman. We are now on 45, 46 stations across the United States, and including Tampa and Houston and Peoria, Illinois, and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Sacramento and San Diego. We're big in California, and a whole bunch of other places, and a few in Canada, and one or two in England and Australia. So we are growing, but we are very eager to grow some more. So if any of you have any connections with any radio station anywhere, where you have a friend or an associate or someone you know who works there and can give us a lead, please do so. We have a person who works with us now whose job it is to follow up on every lead, so I can assure you we will pursue in the hopes of getting many more stations to carry the program. And we're doing quite well. We're very pleased with our growth, and we would like it to continue. The best way to reach us is either to get a card from me before you leave today, or go to our website. We just redecorated and renewed and all the rest our website. It's democracyatwork.info. All one word, democracyatwork.info. And that website, besides giving you tons of more material available at no cost, also provides you with a way to communicate to us about a radio station, a question, a suggestion, or what it is you don't like about us. All of that is read and processed, and we use it to plan everything that we do. Okay, so much for the preliminaries. Let's jump into what's been going on since we talked last month, and what kind of an analysis can we apply to it. Well, the first thing, which is dear to my heart, is this issue of refugees. I'm assuming all of you have been looking at the horrible pictures in the newspapers and on television, the body of the little boy in Europe that washed up on the beach, and countless other images that keep flooding across. Just a few of the economics of it. These are mostly refugees pouring into Europe in whatever way is easiest to get into Europe, and that tends to be the southern part of Europe, people coming across the Mediterranean or coming up through Turkey and the Middle East. The countries from which most of the refugees come are Iraq, Syria, Libya, and other places like that. Some from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but mostly from the Middle East and those countries that I named. There is absolutely no mystery whatsoever about why they're coming. They are coming because these are some of the poorest areas in the world to begin with, and they have been bombed to smithereens by a whole host of invasions, civil wars, struggles among all kinds of groups in and out of those countries, so that the already poor, underdeveloped economies have been strained to the point where people can't live. And by can't live, I don't mean that you're so much in danger of being shot with a bullet. That's actually not your major problem. Your major problem is if you get sick, there's no place to go. The doctors have all left, and even if you can find one, they don't have any medicine, they don't have any equipment, there will not be an ambulance to take you there if you need to go in a hurry, etc., etc. If you're an older person, you run out of your medicine, end of story, because you can't get any more. Most of the people who die and get horribly sick in these situations are civilians, if you like, people who have no direct involvement in whatever the struggles happen to be. But to make a long story short, refugees are created by poverty and war. Together, that's it, number one. Number two, everything we know about refugees teaches us that what makes a refugee is 95% the push factor, the intolerability of staying where they are, not the attractiveness of wherever they may go. That's maybe 5%. People do not depart from the language they know, from the culture they know, from the people and relatives they have, from the village they were born in. They don't do that without enormous incentive, especially when you remember they're going to a place they have never been to before, where they haven't the faintest idea what kind of reception is going to be awaiting for them, no resources to speak of, on and on. You have to make people miserable on a scale that most of us probably don't know, if we're lucky, in order to become a refugee leaving Libya and entering Hungary, to take an example, since that's now a popular track. Approximately 10 million, that's the estimate. By the way, these estimates are not worth much, very hard to make an estimate, but roughly 10 million displaced to such a degree that they've left all of those areas I just mentioned. The Europeans mostly don't want them. But with some struggle, they are now talking, latest figures that I could see, about taking into Europe 120 to 130,000. Now, when you read it in the newspaper, it might strike you that 120,000 is a lot of people, which it surely is. But as a percentage of 10 million, it's less than 2%. The other 98% are trying to go where they will not be taken in. And if those of you don't pay attention, you may have missed that in the last week, there are quite a few examples of people being ejected from various countries in Europe who already arrived there, legally or illegally, but will not. The police force them back. There have been pitched battles between police and refugees, many of whom are traveling with families, including small children. This is a major catastrophe. In the press, you will read stories about how the refugees are fleeing to where conditions are better. Unquestionably true, just not very relevant. They're not fleeing because the conditions are better. They're fleeing because the conditions where they are no longer tolerable. That's how bad they have become. But even more important, why is that part of the world so poor? And why is it beset by war on top of its poverty? War in the Middle East, in the last 10 or 15 years, whatever else you can say about it, has been made much worse and much more widespread by the direct military intervention of the United States and Europe. The countries that don't want to take are not willing to take the results of their own policies. There's a stunning failure in the press to tell people what is the cause of this disaster. And please remember, when we were told 5 and 10 years ago what it would cost to engage in the military activities in Iraq, was there a calculation that included the cost of 10 million refugees? No. Those are all added now, after the event, even though every major military activity in the last 100 years has created armies of refugees. This is not surprising, this is not new, this is not unique. And the hand-wringing, oh my goodness, we have a refugee problem. I mean, I lack an adjective to capture what I think of this. I'll leave it to your imagination what we're looking at here. But we are killing large numbers of people who are simply dying by the wayside, buried in some unmarked grave by the side of some highway in Greece or in Hungary or in the Czech Republic, and so on, because they can't find a place. And even countries you might have thought would behave otherwise don't. The Danes ejected a sizable number of people. Not that many want to go to Denmark because they can't find it. No, it's far away from where these people are coming, so it takes an extra job to get across everywhere and go to Denmark, and the Danes don't want them. The Dutch have been doing that. The Germans are playing a different kind of game. The Germans are short of cheap labor, and this is an easy way to acquire more of it. What that will do to these societies as these folks come in, desperate for any kind of work to survive, willing therefore to work at wages that local folks wouldn't accept, who are not in any union because they're just coming into the country, who are separated by language and 12 other variables. How this is going to affect the working class or the balance between capital and labor, these are questions that are not asked by the people who want to imagine that this is some sudden problem, the cause of which is a great mystery, but we will be sure to take one into each parish, as one great leader advised, which is a lame response, that's the nicest word I can come up with, to a catastrophe of this magnitude. But it's about economics. It's about poverty, it's about misery, aggravated by wars that are also fought for economic reasons in large part, whether it be oil or the geopolitical maneuvers, and these are simply the collateral damage. But when you give people a choice, either die where you are or run in the hope that wherever you run to, you may survive, large numbers of them choose to run. And that's all you see. And if you don't want that, and you don't want to deal with the costs, and you don't want to deal with the social consequences, then don't allow there to be a system that makes one part of the world super rich and the other part desperately poor, that makes sure through television and other mechanisms that those who are desperately poor are constantly shown what it's like not to be desperately poor through television and every other medium, and then be surprised that if you visit on top of all of that war and destruction, they conceive the interesting idea, let's leave where we are and go to what we saw on television. Is it clear to them that what they're going to arrive at is not what's shown on television? No. They think they're all going to the suburbs of Los Angeles. Many of them do, because that's, you know, it's a dream, it's a hope. It's the obverse of what they're living in, and so, you know, it's the kind of fantasy that I'm sure no one in this room, but other people indulge when they buy a lottery ticket. Right? Those strange people who do that, they are like the refugees who imagine maybe life could be other than bombs and sickness and death all around me. Maybe it could be, like I saw on that television program, about the suburbs of Los Angeles and all the happy people that are there. Okay, refugees. A couple other little ones before we get into the big ones. I want to take my hat off, and I want you all to feel good with me, about the state of Washington in the far west. Interesting things this last few weeks in the state of Washington. First, today, the teachers, the public school teachers of Seattle, Washington, walked out. First day of school in that state today, but it isn't the first day of school because thousands of teachers, to strike very solid, didn't cross the picket line, didn't go in. 53,000 students are not going to school in Seattle. Why? I thought you might be interested. First, they haven't had any increase in 6 years, neither a wage increase nor a cost of living adjustment. Okay, if your salary doesn't go up for 6 years, during which time prices in this country went up 2%, and not a lot, but 2% over 6 years, compounding, if you think about it, that means your real income, what you can afford to buy with the money that you're getting the same each year for 6 years, has dropped by about 12-15%. So that's what the teachers got, a drop of about 15% in their pay. So when they started bargaining, the school system came in and said, we're going to offer you 3% per year for the next 3 years. So at the end of the 3 years, roughly 9%, which means 3 years from now, they would be less further behind than they were before. They'd still be behind, mind you, and the teachers came back, not with what you might expect, but with a counter-proposal, 10.5% in 2 years, which kind of might catch them up, almost. Not a revolutionary demand. Oh no, said the school system, we can't, we won't. This is a school system that's already in trouble in the state of Washington. Why? Well, it turns out, when I started doing the research, that the state Supreme Court of the state of Washington found the state of Washington, let's be clear here, it's the Supreme Court of Washington, found the state of Washington, of which it is the court, having violated the right of the young people of the state of Washington to have a public education by having underfunded public schools in the state by $1 million. And the judge fined the state $100,000 a day for as long as it took them to fix it. That's called giving them an incentive. Fix it. Fix it. They're working on it. And one of the things they came up with as a clear way to move forward is to provoke a strike in your largest urban area. Leadership. It's the kind of leadership we have there, and it's the kind we're seeing at the federal level as this campaign, for lack of a more honest word, unfolds. And we watch the clowns hit each other over the head with the large rubber mallets that constitutes debate in our society. But even more interesting about the state of Washington than this, and we'll see, I hope to make a report to you next month on how this strike played itself out. Today was the first day. There's no movement on either side. I checked a half an hour before I came here, so we'll see where that goes. But here's another thing the state did. Again, the Supreme Court of the state of Washington decided this last month, 6-3, that charter schools are unconstitutional. Not a close vote, 6-3. What did their argument consist of? Basically a simple one, in the words of the Chief Justice, and she explained what their reasoning was. The reasoning went like this. Under the laws that were passed, Washington, like most states, passed laws in the last few years allowing charter schools. You all know what a charter school is. Basically, it's a school that is set up privately by a group of parents or whoever wants to send it up and passes certain standards, and then it can function as a school alongside the public school system. And in most states, it can get public money, that is the local funding source, the city or the town where the schools are located, give the charter school the money that would otherwise have gone to the public school if those children had stayed in a public school. So it's a publicly funded private school. In other words, you're all with me. Okay. So they said it's unconstitutional. Why? Well, the Chief Justice explained very simply. The decisions about how to run this school, what to teach the students, how to teach the students, all the decisions that are made in any school to run it are being made by a private group of people who aren't responsible to the public sector. And for the judges it was, if the public is going to fund it, then the public has to have the final say about what goes on in there, because it's public money, and therefore you can't have a private decision-making for the use of public money. And by the way, they have quite a few charter schools. They were all set to open today, and they can't. And all those people have to scramble because their children have to be in school, and the charter school is not available. Of course, if they're in Seattle, no school is available. But nonetheless, they're going to scramble. Besides telling you about this, because it raises all kinds of questions, I wanted to provoke you a little bit. Think of the implications here. Public funding, said the Supreme Court of Washington, should not go to anything that isn't publicly decided. Let's see. Every church in the United States, every synagogue, every Muslim temple, every religious institution in this country is subsidized publicly. I assume you all know that. For those of you that don't believe in religion, you don't think there is a God or so forth, I hate to tell you this, but you are required by the law of the United States to subsidize an institution. Don't tell this to that clerk in the South. You are required to subsidize an institution you don't agree with, because you have to pay the taxes that go. You are all aware of this. When the street cleaner comes down, when that little machine comes down the street and cleans up the stuff in the gutter. They go in front of the church, they clean that up too. You pay a tax as a citizen to help pay the cost of that street cleaner. And your house gets cleaned too by that street cleaner. The church gets cleaned, its street does, but it doesn't pay for that. All right? If there's a fire in the church, and in order to save lives, they pull on the alarm, and the fire men and women come and they prevent the fire. They have to be paid, those firefighters. And they have to fuel the trucks that they come in and buy the hoses and all the rest. The people who pay taxes pay for that. The church that calls the fire alarm and makes the truck come doesn't pay, ready? Anything. The minister, and I don't mean to pick on any denomination. I have the same feeling about all of them. So I don't mean to single any of them out. So the rabbi or the priest or the minister or the imam or anything else you would like is in a position that's the following. We'll never know whether the people of the United States care enough about the religious institutions to pay for them, because we don't require it. The rest of us pay for them. They get them for nothing. Remember that the next time a member of the cloth argues that we shouldn't have the government subsidizing people, and if you want it, you should be able to pay for it yourself. Hold up a large mirror and giggle. Okay? It's even worse with institutions like private universities. It's even worse when those institutions are staggeringly wealthy. So I spent an inordinate amount of my life, inordinate meaning more than 3 days, in these institutions. So I'm going to tell you as an example about one of them. Yale University, hour and a half from here in New Haven, Connecticut. Yale is an institution that has an endowment fund. An endowment fund is sort of like having a savings account. Only unlike yours, it's very large. Don't take this personally. So Yale's is counted in the billions with a B. I don't know what it is these days, but I would say somewhere between 15 and 20 billion dollars is their accumulated wealth. And you know what they do with that? They invest it in order to make it grow. Now, when you think of Yale as an educational institution, you think of teaching and studying. But you're mistaken. Its focus is on making more of what they already have a lot of money. And they have an advantage, because every kind of income Yale gets on top of the 20 billion it already has, every dividend it gets from buying shares of stock, and it owns a lot of stock, every interest payment it gets from every loan it's made a lot of loans, every piece of rent it gets from all the real estate it owns. Yale owns several buildings on Fifth Avenue here in New York, among others. Every nickel of that income, Yale's tax bill on that income is nothing. You work at McDonald's, you get your crappy $8 an hour, and the government comes in and takes a tax from you. But if you're $20 billion Yale University, who wouldn't know what to do with that money if they even think about it, they're allowed to get any income they want, in any form they want, in any activity they want, and they pay nothing. Yale is the largest landowner in the city of New Haven. It's the largest employer in the city of New Haven. It has 200 buildings. And on those 200 buildings that are used for the school, it pays no property tax at all. Nothing. Zilch. Now, if you're the city of New Haven, where I lived for 25 years, then it means if your largest landowner and your largest employer and your richest citizen doesn't pay anything to support the police and the fire and the public schools and everything else, it means that the rest of the community, in this case me, we get to pay more than we otherwise would because they're not paying at all. Let's see what that means. Yale, the billionaire institution, is subsidized by the delivery of public services that the rest of us pay for. This is called Robin Hood upside down. This is called stealing from the poor to make the rich richer still. Half of New Haven is Hispanic or African American. New Haven qualifies as the 7th poorest city in the United States. This is calculated by the US Census Bureau. They have a simple rule, a simple measurement. You take the number of families in the town, total, that's the denominator in your fraction, and in the numerator, the number of families who live below the poverty line. And that's a measure of how poor the city is. By that measure, used all the time by the US Census Bureau, New Haven is one of the 10 poorest cities in America, usually ranks around number 7. So let's review. The 7th poorest city in America subsidizes the 4th richest university on the planet. As usual, if we had more time, I would stop and we would play the national anthem. Because if anything is beautiful, that's beautiful. Okay. Oh, there is a footnote. Could you change all of this? Could you tax Yale? Could you tax churches? Of course you could. How do I know? We did in America. Don't tell anyone, it's very upsetting. It's never happy for people to hear that their history includes something they wanted to believe is not imaginable. Yale got an exemption from paying the taxes it had to pay for a wonderful argument back in colonial days. Here was what it was. English people, British people, had come to North America. They had done the usual number on the local folk. Kill them. Clean them out. Ethnic cleansing early on, before we had the name. And when they were done doing this thing, one of the first things they wanted to do was to build churches. You might even speculate, if you were psychologically so inclined, that they had something to be guilty about. Maybe they wanted absolution for something. I'll leave it to you to imagine what that might be. But they wanted to build churches. And it turns out, among these Protestant folk, because that's who they were in the Puritan case, you may remember your American history, that in order to have these churches, they needed somebody who knew what to do. You know, how the prayers go and which end of the Bible you read from first, and that kind of thing. They needed ministers. And those were scarce. Turns out ministers had a pretty cushy arrangement back in England, and the prospect, reminds me of my refugee story, the prospect of leaving their comfortable home in England to go to it wasn't attractive. So we had colonists, but no ministers. They had to fix this because they wanted these churches, because the guilt was eating them up. So they created schools to train ministers from the local folks. But it turned out that you'd have to pay the teacher. You'd have to make it worthwhile for the minister to come from England to be the teacher. And you'd have to make a little school building where you could train them. And this cost money. And I don't want to feed into anyone's ethnic stereotype, but the Yankees in Connecticut didn't want to spend the money. So they reached a compromise. They would allow the first school for ministers to be located in New Haven, Connecticut, near the water. The Long Island Sound is there. And in order to make it manageable, here goes, they would give them an exemption from taxes. They wouldn't be so expensive because they wouldn't have to pay any taxes. So into the laws of Connecticut was written Yale, that was the name of the school because of the man who had the land where it was located. Yale wouldn't have to pay taxes, and the argument was straightforward because the local community, Protestant community, would get the benefit of this by having ministers in the churches. So you give them a break, and you in the community will have to pay more because, you know, we're taking care of these people and they don't pay, the school folks, in learning how to be ministers. But it's okay because we get the benefit. Now fast forward with me to today. $20 billion institution. Does its output serve the city of New Haven? Well, if you believe that, then I can't help you anymore. Yale is aware that it's in New Haven and regrets it. It could care less about the city. It has shown that in countless ways. It is a world-class institution. The way we know that is because it says so all the time. And it's famous all over the world, and it educates the greatest, most important people. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, they all went to Yale, and you can see obviously what kind of a superior institution that obviously is, et cetera, et cetera. So the notion that to give them a tax exemption from paying all the property taxes in New Haven is done because they are such a blessing to New Haven, again, I cannot help you if that line of thought makes some sense to you. It doesn't to most of the rest of us. When there were movements, of which I was a part, to make Yale pay taxes, and by the way, that would transform the city of New Haven. The Yale community, students, faculty, and workers, about 17,000 people. The city of New Haven, in which it's located, population, 125,000 people. If Yale paid the taxes the same rate everybody else, the city of New Haven would be the most famous city in the United States because the conditions for people to go to school and to live there would be so extravagant they'd have to have walls to keep everybody else out. So Yale doesn't pay. And when there was a movement to get them to pay, they gathered the local rabbis, priests, and ministers to come together and say, gee, you don't want to tax us locally beneficial institution. At least a local church serves the people in that community. It's at least they can make that argument. To which the answer was, and that's why I mentioned it to you, we can have what's called a circuit breaker or an exemption. The first $1 million of property that you have, no property tax. And the first $1 million of income you earn a year, no tax either. That takes care of every church. And that leaves Yale out there dangling in the wind. When I had this conversation, I was on a city commission in New Haven at the time. I lived there. I was approached by two people at Yale who said to me, half jesting, they wanted me to know that they had had a conversation over at Yale to find out whether there's any way that having given someone an advanced degree, you could take it back. I laughed with them, but I noticed a different tone to my laughter and theirs as we laughed about this. Okay. I was struck this last weekend by reading the New York Times, an exercise I do only because the other newspapers are worse. And there was an article by a fellow economist. His first name is a letter, N. Then his next name is Gregory. N is probably something that he's ashamed of, right? N. Gregory Mankiw, which is already troubling because it's spelled M-A-N-K-I-W. That's a little unusual. So, Gregory Mankiw. He is a professor of economics at Harvard, which is like Yale, only richer, okay? And not in New Haven, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Boston. But he's what Harvard thinks is important. He's written an article, he writes regularly for the New York Times. He's written an article called Shifting the Tax Burden to Cut Carbon. He notes here, to his credit, that conservatives, the phrase he likes for himself, conservative economists are not normally among those most concerned about global warming, climate change, and all those other things. And he's surely right about that. And he wants to say, I'm different, I am. He spends the opening paragraphs with a great deal of self-congratulation about this breakthrough he has achieved. And then he goes on to say, there are two ways of handling this. If you're at Harvard, you say things like, there are two ways of handling this. You never make sentences like, I've only thought of two. You don't do it. One of the things you learn at Harvard is never put yourself as a subjective person with an opinion. Your opinion is on high. It is the truth. And the people listening to you are lucky that you're there to give it to them. Okay? And so Mr. Mankiw has absorbed, he's been at Harvard for quite a long time, he's absorbed the rule, and he's telling us there are two ways. The first way, he explains, is by having the government regulate the use of carbon, which causes all this bad stuff in the air. And here's what he writes. I'm going to read it to you. A regulatory system that tried to achieve all of this, controlling carbon, would be heavy-handed and less effective. Translated, poo-poo on that. But he can't say poo. At Harvard, you don't say poo-poo. A footnote for those of you. I went to Harvard. I'm a graduate of Harvard. I'm not proud of it, but it is the fact. I did go there. So I want you to know that when I make fun of them, I know whereof I speak. Okay. What's the alternative that Professor Mankiw wants? We should put a price on carbon. In other words, if you use up carbon, if you put heating oil in your furnace in your house, or gasoline in your car, or you use electricity, these other unusual acts, the price should go up because you have a tax on the fact that you're burning carbon. And here's how he writes it. The man's sharp. Putting a price on carbon alters incentives in many ways. It encourages people to switch to cleaner forms of generating electricity, like wind and solar instead of coal. It encourages people to buy more fuel-efficient cars, to form carpools with their neighbors, and to use more public transportation. Mr. Mankiw has worked it out, see? You got two choices. Jack up the price of everything that uses carbon. That's how to be effective. Or have the government regulate. That never works. Okay, let's take a look at this. What's the first thing that happens if you jack up the price of everything that uses carbon? You're screwing the poorest people, aren't you? Because they're the ones who now can't afford. The rich people give a happy if the cost of gasoline goes up $1. They don't even notice it. Ditto for the heating oil. Ditto for... So Mr. Mankew's idea of how you solve a problem that affects the whole society is to take a step that systematically discriminates against middle and low income people, and he doesn't even think of it. He doesn't refute it. He doesn't excuse it. He's at Harvard. He doesn't know what that is anyway. I grew up in a poor household. When I got to Harvard, I discovered that there is this thing called roast beef. I had not known what that. When we had beef, we had something I later learned is called chuck steak. Chuck steak is a large piece of bone to which there is attached an even larger piece of fat. And between the bone and the fat, you find, because it's there, little bits of meat. And you focus on those until it becomes too arduous, and then you just eat the fat. But when I got to Harvard, I discovered roast beef and things like that. And I realized I hadn't been prepared at my high school because I lacked a tweed jacket. So I had almost no money, and I went and I bought a tweed jacket to fit in. I was quickly apprised by my dorm mates that my tweed jacket was lacking. What did it lack? A leather patch on the elbow. Well, being an idiot, I thought you put a patch when you wear it out to hide the patch. They looked at me as if I had just fallen off the garbage truck as it passed, and explained with great compassion mixed with ridicule that a tweed jacket without a leather patch said things about me my worst enemy wouldn't have thought of. I went, and with money I did not have, purchased a leather patch for and thereby fit in to Harvard, as you can see from the way I discuss it to this day. Other story, also from Sunday's New York Times, but on the front page. A story, if you missed it, you really have got to see. Here's what it is. It's a fight between Monsanto, that's a huge chemical giant, and a number of organic firms like Stonyfield Farm. Some of you know it makes yogurt and things like that. And here's what they're fighting over. Does it make a difference whether you have a chemistry set mixed in with your yogurt or not? Some of you, being underdeveloped people, actually think yogurt has something to do with enzymes and bacteria and milk. You don't understand that that is yogurt Stone Age. Nowadays, you take a chemistry set, at least 47 chemicals you cannot pronounce, mix them together, put them in the yogurt, take out annoying nutrition, and put a plop of very old pineapple at the bottom, and eat that. Okay, and it turns out there's a dispute. The New York Times, with the same wonder in its mind that you get at Harvard, has an article. And it turns out that Monsanto has gotten a whole bunch of scientists. These are people who have gone to places like Harvard and Yale, spent a lot of years talking with their professors, at the end of which they are christened scientists. And this is very important because if you have a scientific degree, Monsanto wants to talk to you. Why? Because they want to trot you out there saying that these chemicals that are in there, wow, they cure baldness, they give you the sex life you had only dreamed of, and have several other wonderful virtues, none of which simple yogurt could hope to attain. Stonyfield makes simple yogurt. They learned in order to survive, they've got to get scientists who tell you that those chemicals are awful. So the public is confronted with scientists who say the one is good and the other one is bad, and a bunch of other scientists who say, in other words, the bad one is good and the good one is bad. And the outcome depends on who has more money to buy more scientists. You are all eating the results of who has more money. Good luck. Monsanto is a very large company. Stonyfield is a very little company. So you're going to hear a great deal more about the wonders of modern yogurt than you are about its problems. If you have private enterprise producing your food, if that's a decision you make as a society, which we have, and if you understand that every private enterprise is driven by the so-called bottom line to maximize the profits without which they will not be able to compete against the next one, then you can't be surprised. And the New York Times can't be surprised if it turns out that the striving for the maximum profit means you give short shrift to matters of health or science or anything else. You get the best food profits make possible. And that's why you're full of chemicals you don't understand, diseases you cannot explain, and all the rest of it. This is not because science has gone crazy. This is because you subordinate a scientific discussion to the profits. You allow one set of points of view in science to be everywhere because the money to pay for that is provided by the company whose profits depend on it. Whereas the other point of view is championed by somebody who doesn't have as many profits. You lose. Your decisions are made by people for whom profit is the game. It would be strange. You know, we don't allow in the United States 12 armies. We don't do that. We're kind of nervous that if the United States is going to go to war in Iraq or Afghanistan, what are we going to do? Take bids? Army number one. What do you offer? Army number two. We might get worried that a competing army might offer a lower bid and then throw bullets made out of marshmallows because it's cheaper. So we don't allow competition among armies. We have one army, and we go with that. Why do we allow competition among food producers? Why do we allow competition among health providers? What are we doing? Are we crazy? We are making the things that shape the fundamentals of life and death subordinated to a profit calculus by people who have to do that, otherwise they lose their job. You're not hired in a food company in order to do good things for the people. You're hired to make the stocks go up, the profits go up, the company grow. That's what you're hired for. If you do that, you keep your job and you get a bonus. And if you don't do it, goodbye. This is not a bad person story. This is a structure. And you ought to wonder about a society that makes that decision. All right, let's go on to the major topics in the time that we have left. First, China. Okay. The United States economy is in trouble. It has gone absolutely nowhere in the year 2015, and in the last 3 weeks, the stock market is like a roller coaster bouncing up and down, went down a couple, 200 or 300 points today, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So things are not in good shape, in case you haven't been aware. And so one of the first things we do here in the United States when our economy is in trouble is we blame somebody else. Years ago, some of you have been around a while, the Japanese. Well, that's a hard sell these days. No problem, the Chinese. Maybe it'll be the Malaysians next. Okay, we really like to put the finger on somebody else. It's a little painfully transparent and childish. For an economist to do it, it's beyond words. So let's take a look at what is that. Is the Chinese economy having problems? Absolutely. And that is, of course, going to affect the rest of the world because China is now the second most important economy in the world after the United States. So anything that happens in a country that important to the world economy is going to ramify, is going to have effects everywhere. So yes, that's the grain of truth. If there's ups and downs in China, then those are going to show up with effects everywhere else. China is, after all, the largest country by population in the world, and it is now the second most industrially developed society, having surpassed the Europeans and the Japanese. Now let's take a look at China to make sure we all kind of understand. The Chinese experience of economic development to being such a powerhouse that what happens there is front page news in the United States. Every time something happens there, it's front page news. This is about 25 years old. That's all. 25 years ago, you didn't read stories about China, hardly at all. And you certainly didn't get them every day. So something extraordinary has happened in a very short time. 25 years in the People's Republic of China. Let's quickly review. 1, somewhere between 400 and 500 million people. That's a population way larger than the total population of the United States, which is about 320 million. So somewhere between 400 and 500 million people in China were moved from the rural to the urban, from the interior to the coast, from agriculture to industry. This process took centuries in Europe and the United States. It took 25 years. We have no example in human history of people going through anything like that change in every dimension of their lives. Life in a Chinese village is very different from life in Shanghai or Beijing or any of the major cities. And that's a transition that in all populations takes a long time to digest as human beings, to become accustomed to these ways of living. How the Chinese are doing it is a mystery. During that period of time, they built dozens of huge modern cities that weren't there. We're talking about places that were fields 25 years ago and are now skyscrapers that look like Midtown Manhattan. Lots of them in China. Every traveler there comes back with these stories. I mean, it's amazing. During this period of time, China went from a society that produced little or nothing to a society that produces everything. All of your clothing, all of your appliances, they either come from China or they come from countries mimicking China. Not a few of them come from China, but for reasons of law and taxes, pull the label of made in China off and stick on the label made in Bangladesh. But they're made in China. Just as they used to say, made in Hong Kong. No, they weren't. They shipped through Hong Kong, but they were made in the People's Republic of China. So fantastic was their growth that basically they learned in a generation how to make most of what is made by the capitalist West as well as, but for much less money than, their competitors in the United States and Europe, which is why you're buying their clothing, their appliances, and everything else, because it's as good or better and much cheaper. So effective were they that they accumulated an incredible amount of revenue. Just think, they sold all this stuff for euros in Europe, for dollars in the United States, for pounds in Britain, and so on. And they collected all of that revenue. Meanwhile, the Chinese didn't buy anywhere near that much stuff from the rest of the world, which means a lot of the money they got from selling to everybody, they didn't need to buy things from the rest of the world. So they accumulated reserves, they're called. Revenue coming in for which they had no need. And so they had to make a decision, just like you would. If you accumulated net revenue to the tune of, as it turns out, trillions of dollars, here's what they did. They lent it. And above all, they lent it to the United States government. That's right. When the government, try to hold on to this. For most Americans, when I explain this, this is so troubling. It's in one ear and right out the other one. When the government fixes the road in front of your house, when it lends to your cousin Harry's daughter so she can go to college, you have to thank the People's Republic of China because the money your government is using to help you is theirs. And if they didn't lend it to your government couldn't do it. The Chinese, just to show you the complexity, opposed the US attack in Iraq while funding it. Understand? They did. Americans can't. But you have to. The United States, over the last same generation, was in a completely different place. It wasn't producing, I'm going to exaggerate now, but just to get you the idea, it was producing less than it ever did before. We don't produce any of our clothing anymore, you know that. We don't produce any of our TVs, any of our watches, hardly anything. And our working class, we haven't given them a rise in wages forever. So what our working class lived off of in the last 25 years was borrowing. They borrowed. They borrowed from banks. But where did the banks get the money? Part of the money they got was, the People's Republic of China. So the American working class was financed in its levels of consumption, which it could no longer afford by rising wages because the wages weren't rising. What was rising was the level of debt. And that money came in good part from, oh goodness, communists. You're living off the money of communists, while waving the American flag, a flag which, if you turn over underneath it, is made in China. I think today's presentation is affected by Steve Colbert or something like that. Okay, so what's the point here of the story? China made a decision 25 years ago to become a rich, powerful economic force. They made a decision. And they decided to do it by doing two major things. First, unlike what the Soviet Union had done, for all kinds of reasons, the Chinese decided that the way to develop an industry, the way to have jobs on the coast, in the big cities, for all those hundreds of millions coming off the countryside to work in, they had to produce for the rest of the world. They had to be an export-oriented economy. The Chinese people were too poor. Even though a lot of them, they didn't have enough money. To produce for the Chinese market would be produced for a market that was too small to sustain the jobs and the industry they wanted to build. To do that, they had to become the producer for the world. they had to clothe not just the Chinese people, but you and me too, and produce the toasters we use and the TVs that we use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They hitched their star, their well-being, to the capitalist West. They produced for Europe and North America, and also Japan. The three big, powerful, capitalist consuming cultures were who the Chinese built their industries to serve. In doing that, they proved brilliant. The strategy was, we can produce for that market better and cheaper than their own companies can, and they did. That worked. It did what they wanted, made them an industrial power. But it did it by making them, ready, dependent on the capitalist West. Second decision, closely wrapped up with the first. They believed they couldn't do that by themselves. So 25 years ago, they said to the big multinational capitalist corporations of the world, come here. Come here. We will provide you with huge numbers of workers, much cheaper than what you have in the United States or Britain or France or Italy or Japan. Much, much cheaper. A government that will help you every conceivable way, that will build the roads just where you need them, will build the infrastructure, we call it, that you will need. We will do everything to help you succeed as a capitalist, private enterprise inside the People's Republic of China. And that worked too. Company after company, American, Japanese, British, German, Italian, Spanish, moved. The United States is littered with empty factories. Those companies are still here. They're still producing what they always did, but they're producing it over there in China, not here. Half, remember this number, roughly half of the goods coming into the United States from China are made in China, yup, by Chinese workers, yup, but in companies that are subsidiaries of American corporations who went there, set up shop, hired Chinese workers to produce the goods they then ship back home. The biggest corporation in the United States today by employment is the Walmart store business. They bought Chinese goods and delivered them into every corner of the United States. China could never have done what it did simply by being a good producer, because you got to get it into Yipsy Doodle, Ohio, and Wumpty Bumblum, Wyoming. How are you going to get it there? It can be a wonderful product, but there has to be a distribution system. If the Chinese had had to do that on their own, it would have taken them another 25 or 50 years. And everybody would have looked at the Chinese department store, and it would have taken a long time to go in there, wouldn't it have? They didn't have that problem. It's your friendly Walmart. And a deal was struck, by the way. Once a year, the Walmart and the Chinese leadership get together at a lovely resort, shake hands, go swimming, and make fun of us. That's a marriage made somewhere. Walmart handled the Chinese goods. That gave China the distribution system, and it gave Walmart the one up on everybody else. They had the best, cheapest stuff. Now at least they have half of that. The cheapest stuff. Walmart and China. Private enterprise and communism in a partnership. China is the largest creditor in the world. The United States is the largest debtor in the world. We owe everything to the People's Republic of China. The most successful capitalist country is in hock up to its ears to the most important communist country. And again, if I had time, we'd interrupt this program and bring you the national anthem once again. If you hook your star, as China did, to capitalism by producing exports for capitalist markets and by bringing in capitalist enterprises, guess what? You're making your country vulnerable to whatever capitalism brings in. If you really love stray cats, and when they come to your back porch and you put out a little saucer with milk or cream, and they are grateful, and then you bring them into the house, it's charming, it's wonderful, but you're going to realize pretty quick that with the stray cat, other things come too, and those are not so pleasant. If you hook yourself up to capitalism, first you're going to get instability. Capitalism is a system that is unstable. Every 3 to 7 years, wherever capitalism has ever come, it has an economic downturn. Periodically, these downturns are called recessions, and if they get really bad, which they periodically do, then they are depressions. You know, depression economically, it's in the economy like it is if you're not feeling real good for a while. You are depressed, so is an economy. Capitalism goes through this all the time. It's a sickness. How do we know? Nobody wants a depression. Nobody wants an economic downturn. Pick up the newspaper when there's a story of a downturn. It's always written like, oh, this is terrible, it's horrible, don't like it, bad, no good. What kind of society holds on to an economic system that delivers something nobody wants with stunning regularity? Hello? Something screwy here. I've always liked in my classes to say at this point, so I'm going to do it again. Some of you have heard this. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago or demanded that the roommate get professional help. Why do you stay with an economic system that is so unstable? You know, capitalists are frightened of the instability of their system. They have worked very hard, I know a lot of them, they've worked very hard to try to figure out what causes it and what can we do. And they've developed policies. They force us in graduate school to learn them all. Monetary policies and fiscal policies. They developed institutions like the Federal Reserve System and the Treasury to do this and to do that, to what? To prevent the instability. And they have a stunning record. No success at all, ever. The greatest minds, for example, in the middle of the Great Depression of the 1930s, a brilliant economist, the smartest one at the time, John Maynard Keynes, a member of the British aristocracy, a professor of economics at Cambridge, which is the highest level you can get in Great Britain, writes a famous book explaining here's why these terrible things happen in capitalism, and here's what we will do about it. And people try. They use what he writes. And so the profession is full of endless debates. Underscore the word endless. Keynes, the government has to get in there to deal with this. No, say the conservatives. The government only makes it worse. Okay, we'll get the government out. Oh, but then we have a collapse. Oh, we'll bring the government in. Yeah, but it makes it worse. Oh, over and over. For graduate students, it's a torment. You have to read 8 million versions of this same stale debate. The bottom line is, after 250 years, they haven't been able to stop this instability, which means if the Chinese are half the Marxists they say they are, they should have known, and I'm sure they did. Like with the kitty that you bring in through the back porch with the little milk, you're going to get, with capitalism, so guess what China is experiencing now? An economic downturn. Surprise. but because they're now the second biggest economy in the world, if they have an economic downturn, everybody else trembles. No mystery here at all. Second, remember, they brought in huge capitalist corporations. Well, that's like the kitty again. You're bringing in capitalism, and with it come the fleas, like with the kitty, right? So you bring in these big corporations. When the big corporations went into China, starting in the 1980s, 1990s, and so on, here's what they did. Take an example. Manufacturer of automobile parts closes the factory in Detroit or in Youngstown, Ohio, or wherever they were, and opens a factory in Shanghai or Beijing or Tianjin or wherever they are, or for that matter in India or Brazil or any of the other places. It's not all about China. Well, they're excited. They're starting a kind of new phase of their company. They're closing Detroit, but they now want to take advantage. They're excited. They're going to have workers at a small fraction of what they paid before. Chinese workers are cheap by American standards, as are Bangladeshis or Indians or Brazilians. And they're going to take the latest technology and they're going to say, well, we can win the world market because we're going to be producing the same stuff we've always produced, but at a much lower price because we're paying these Chinese workers next to nothing. So they're excited and here we go, they expand their capacity. They build more capacity in China than they closed here in the United States. So over 25 years, the capacity to produce is enlarged as a byproduct of moving it from the West to the East. End result, by 2010 and 15, we have, guess what? Way more capacity to produce than we have a market for people to buy this stuff. And it's even worse because the mass of people are no longer getting the wages they once got in the United States up here. They're now getting the wages that the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians share. So the market has gone down in terms of what people can afford at the same time that capitalism has created a capacity to produce that's larger. Guess what? They're going to be unable to recoup their investment because they can't sell all they're capable of producing. Classic problem of capitalism. Nothing new about it, nothing surprising, and that's what we got. We got the Chinese going, oh my God, how are we going to keep our people working? There's no market. People are not buying the quantities of Chinese stuff that the Chinese are capable of producing. And so Chinese producers, their market is drying up and they can't afford to keep their workers working, and the rate of growth of their economy is slipping, and they have more and more problems, and those wash over here to the United States. But to look at all of that and say, it's the Chinese, misunderstands everything. The problem isn't the Chinese. The problem is capitalism. That's how it works. And when capitalism is brought into China, it does what it has done everywhere else. It produces a false inadequacy, a false shortage. In the United States today, 20% of our tools and equipment are sitting idle. That's a statistic from the Federal Reserve Bank of Washington, the Federal Reserve System. It's called capacity utilization. It's the percentage of your capacity to produce that is sitting idle. 20%. Next to it, we have millions of Americans. Estimate these days 10 to 20, depending on how you count. 10 to 20 million Americans without work who want a job. Okay, let's do this. We have 10 million, be conservative, people who want to work. We have all the tools and equipment sitting, gathering rust and dust for them to work with, to produce an amount of output that could take care of those 10 million refugees. Would take about 2 weeks. We'd have them a house and a car and a job and an education. We can do it as a people, but we are saddled with, and we are deeply committed to, an economic system that undermines our capacity to do what we know would be in our best interest. That's when you need psychological help in a big way. Stock market instability in the United States is really a mirror of all of this. It's the same problem in this country, because whatever overwashing from China is happening here, we have our own problems here that we can't solve. There was a statistic I wanted to give you just because I thought it captured this so nicely. Yeah, it's from the LA Weekly, Los Angeles Weekly. It measures monthly entrances into and exits out of homelessness in Los Angeles County. And the line, I mean, you can't see it from here, but the line, this low point is 2007, the last year before the crisis. And if you can see, some of you in the front can see, the line goes straight up, just straight up. So by measuring the number of people who are becoming homeless, there's no recovery. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And I have a metric too. I live here, not very far from here, 15th Street, okay? Over the last 5 years, when I first started living there, I never encountered what I now encounter several times a day. I have to step over a person lying on a piece of cardboard on the street, right up against the wall or in a doorway, over and over again. I didn't have that in the previous summers. And the signs are everywhere. What recovery? For whom? It's like that Harvard professor. You solve the problem by jacking up the prices. The idea of who then pays for the social problem. Who is the one who can't afford to use their car, heat their home? The fact that it doesn't cross the man's mind. In his world, it's either the prices or the government bureaucrats. And who would want a government bureaucrat? So we're left with the prices. Hello. What? You know, there's 8,000 studies that indicate the number one cause of wasted energy in this country is the private automobile. The number one cause of death in this country is the private automobile. Number one cause of injury is the private automobile. Air pollution, private automobile. The solution to death, pollution, wasted energy, it's all the private automobile. What would you need to have in order not to have the private automobile? A decent public transportation system like exists in many countries. So we have lots of models to choose from, don't we? The country that is making the greatest use these days of the fast train, by the way, fast train, for those of you not aware of it, is not something that you can try here in the United States because we don't have it. The closest we have is the Excella thing that runs from Washington to Boston, and that's not that much faster than the regular train if you've looked at the schedules. In Europe, there are fast trains, TGV, all over Europe. Train grande vitesse, high speed. But the greatest producer of fast trains is the country in the world that is hooking up all of its new big cities with super fast trains. And that is the People's Republic of China, which is right now about to get, if my information is correct, the contract from the state of California to finally produce rapid trains. Because the state of California, which didn't want to give the contract to the People's Republic of China, cannot justify giving it to anybody else, given the quality and the price. But we don't do that. We're not going to make it a public transportation system. We're not going to do it because this is a society that is committed to private, free enterprise. For the same reason that this Harvard professor cannot see beyond crappy bureaucracy or the price system that is so efficient. Amazing. This is not about economics, is it? This is about ideology. This is about people's ways of putting blinders on themselves even when the crisis is staring them right in the face, 2 inches from their nose. It makes you kind of wonder, just how bad does it have to get before you kind of shake people out of the make-believe and fantasy worlds that we occupy when it comes to economics. A final personal note, because some of you have asked, and I will say it to you. I am a product, that's why I mentioned it earlier, I am a product of elite education here in the United States. The reason I started tonight about refugees is that both of my parents were refugees. So I have a feeling for that situation. Both of them came from Europe to the United States, running for their lives, arrived here with nothing. No money, no nothing. Right? My father was a workaholic, bad, had that disease very bad. But one of the benefits of being a workaholic is you make some money and you save the money. And me being the first child, that money was used to send me to school, in the hopes that by getting to school, I would rise up out of the poverty that my family came with. And so I went to Harvard. I was the kid who got the scholarship and went to Harvard. And when I finished at Harvard, I went to Stanford, spent a year there. And then I went to Yale. So here I am, 10 years of Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. They all taught me as best they could to understand, appreciate, and applaud the capitalist system. They failed. And I tell you the story only given all the work they put in, given the fact that I was more than willing to be persuaded, to be convinced. I had all the qualities of a student. I wanted to succeed. I wanted to get an A. I wanted the teacher to like me. All of that. Everything this system had going for it to get me to be an enthusiastic supporter, endorser, and promoter. A system that can lose someone like me so eager to support it really has to use a technical term, suck. That's the thing to say to you as a little boy in that famous story with the emperor. Remember the story? The emperor's got no clothes. Yes. Capitalism is an emperor with no clothes. And all you're beginning to see, which I must admit for someone of my age, you can tell from my hair, is something I hadn't expected to see in my lifetime, which is why I'm having such a good time. That this is a country that is finally figuring it out. It's slow, it's painfully slow, and it's got 2 steps forward and 6 slips backward, but nonetheless, finally, it's possible to go. This Saturday, I fly out of here to, just give you an idea of America, I'm flying to Kansas City. Sunday morning in the 3rd largest church of Kansas City, I am the morning speaker before the service, because they have a social justice session before the service. Monday, I speak at the University of Missouri of Kansas City, a major campus for them. I do a radio interview. In the afternoon, I give a seminar in the economics department of the University of Missouri. and then I fly back here. And I do this sort of thing twice a month. Until 4 years ago, I never did that. I'm the same person, but there was no audience. Now, the same person saying pretty much the same thing has more audience than he can handle. And I tell you that because it's not me. Whatever skills of delivery and presentation I have, and in case you have any illusion, I work at these performances. I do. I don't deny it for a minute. But it isn't me, because I've been doing this a long time. Starting 4 years ago, this country changed. I don't know exactly how, I don't know exactly why, but something is going on here that is amazing to catalog. And for those that are watching this, here are the places I am scheduled to speak over the next 6 weeks, besides Kansas City. Tampa, Florida, Houston, Texas. Tampa, Florida, Houston, Texas, Ames, Iowa, Fresno, California, Seattle, Washington, Berkeley, California, Farmingdale on Long Island, and LIU Post, wherever exactly that is, somewhere out on the island as well. That's 6 weeks of me running around like a crazy person, trying to deal with the audiences that want me to do something that audiences like that haven't wanted in this country's history for half a century. So something is shifting. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll see you in October.